Hi, I'm Jess, and I'm here with my co-host Junaid. Welcome to Can I Just Qualify That? Ofqual's podcast about regulation, qualifications, and everything in between. Today, we're going to be talking about GCSE and A Level marking and grading. So, in other words, what happens between exams and results day? Before I do that, Junaid, what's new in your world?
I've been working on reform. I think results day is around the corner, so my team is, unlike most of Ofqual, my team is not so much directly involved with results day on the day. So reform is continuing to be the main bit of work I'm on. How about you?
Well, it's very important that continues.
Indeed.
My team's been really busy leading up to results day. Really big moment for students, but also a big moment for Ofqual. There's a saying that it's always summer in Ofqual, and it's definitely summer now.
Yeah. So, as we've just mentioned, when you hear this, you may be just about to pause your summer holiday relaxation to gear up for the A Level or GCSE results days. If you taught Year 13s or Year 11s last year, you'll be thinking about them and the results they're about to get. You might even be thinking about your department results in your school and conversations with head teachers that you're going to be having. We want you to feel confident that you can answer students' questions on or after results day. To be able to do that, you need to know the journey from exams to results and how that whole process works, and be able to spot the myths when you hear them. That's why today we are joined by one of the most knowledgeable people in the sector when it comes to how this all works, Frances Wilson, Ofqual's Associate Director for Standards. Welcome, Frances.
Thank you. So, Frances, an awful lot happens, doesn't it, between the time that students put down their pens in June when they finish their exams and collect their results in August. But before you tell us about that, why do you think it's important that teachers understand this process?
It's a really good question. Well, I think because it's just so important that grades are fair and they reflect students' achievements. But if students, and in fact teachers as well, don't really understand the process of getting from that script to results, then I think there's a real problem that they might worry about the fact that their grades aren't fair and they don't really reflect their achievements. So I think it's really helpful for teachers because, of course, students do tend to turn to teachers in their schools for information about this sort of stuff. So as long as teachers understand how it works, then they can give their students the right information and provide that reassurance that their grades will be fair and reflect their achievements.
Absolutely. So, shall we start with marking?
Absolutely.
Can you give us an idea of the scale of it? How many students, how many exam papers, and how many examiners are we really talking about?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that it's really big, probably bigger than some people think. So, for example, last year in 2025, we had over 1.3 million students taking GCSE, AS and A Level exams, and they were in over 6,000 schools and colleges across England. I mean, that's quite a lot to start with.
Indeed.
And then between them, those students took over 1,400 different exam papers, producing between them a really massive over 17 million exam scripts.
Wow.
It's huge. And so the exam boards, wanting to get them marked, as well as possible, they issued about 73,000 marking contracts to examiners last year.
And what happens once students put their pens down in the exam hall? So what's the next stage?
Well, the very first stage is that schools and colleges send those exam scripts back to the exam board. And the first thing that happens there is that they're scanned, because most marking these days happens on screen. And just thinking back to those 17 million scripts, even the scanning operation alone is a massive operation. And then once scripts are scanned, senior examiners start to take a look at student responses, just to see how they've responded to the questions in the papers.
When you say senior examiners, just want to be absolutely clear. So what makes a senior examiner a senior examiner? Are we talking about people who've been doing it for a number of years, or is it a specific position? I mean, what is it?
So there are some specific positions, and these are people who will have been examining for a number of years. Normally they'd be started as teachers, then they would have been a sort of a normal examiner for several years, and then when they become more senior, they become more involved in supervising other examiners, writing mark schemes, maybe setting the question papers.
Right.
So these are people who are real experts in examining. And so they're checking the mark schemes that they've drafted before students at the exam and make sure that they're reflecting the full range of student responses. And then once they've done that, they start to train the full examining team. to make sure that they can apply those mark schemes really accurately and consistently. So it doesn't matter which examiner you get, you know your script will be marked really accurately. And then once examiners have been trained, they need to firstly demonstrate that they can mark accurately and consistently before they're let loose on marking real student scripts.
Mm-hmm.
Marking proceeds for another few weeks, and then once marking is nearly complete, that's when exam boards set grade boundaries. And when we say set grade boundaries, they define how many marks you need to get a particular grade. Once those grade boundaries have been set and finalised, then all students are graded against those grade boundaries, and then those results are sent to schools in time for results day, where they can be shared with students.
Wow, so there's lots of work that's going on behind the scenes from when students finish their exams to getting their results, and massive scale, as you say, talking about those numbers. I suppose a system of that size, there are going to be errors every year, and you've talked a little bit about ways that they can be mitigated by examiners training and that type of thing. What else is Ofqual doing to ensure that there's, the marking is accurate and that students are getting results that are fair?
So I think it's fair to say that considerations of accuracy and consistency are built into every stage of the process. So one of the first really important things to know is that when examiners are marking a response, they don't see the student's name, they don't know which school or college they're from, they don't know which part of the country they're from. All they're doing is looking at the work that the student has produced in that exam and looking at it in relation to the mark scheme. So that helps make it fair, because examiners can't be unconsciously biased depending on where a student's from. So that's a really important thing. The examiners themselves, sort of even your normal examiners, they're typically really experienced teachers or ex-teachers, so they've got a lot of experience of looking at student work. They're subject experts. And as we've said, they need to be trained very thoroughly before they're allowed to start marking. And then once they're marking, they're monitored really closely. So, for example, when exams are marked on screen, as most of them are these days, one of the really key measures that exam boards take is they drop in some scripts that have already been marked by a senior examiner, so they can compare the mark that the examiner gives to the mark that the senior examiner gave to make sure that it's an appropriate mark.
And when you say script, do you mean exam paper, right?
Or
Yes.
in some cases.
Well, it depends. So sometimes it's the whole exam paper. In some cases, the script has actually been split up into different questions, so you have examiners specialised on particular questions in the exam paper.
Yeah, I remember when I did some marking before I started working at Ofqual, and when I was a teacher for one of the exam boards for the maths papers, and that's how they did theirs. So they were split into items, and then we'd be allocated a certain number of items. But yes, those sort of seeded ones I'm aware of, and it was sort of a bit of an unspoken thing, but we all knew that they would be in there, and if we ever, I don't know, disagreed or didn't get the result that we were supposed to get on that item, then we'd be called up by our team leader, and there'd be conversations had.
If a problem is found with an examiner's marking, they can be stopped from marking, and then the scripts that they've already marked would be checked and maybe remarked by another examiner. So any errors in marking would be corrected at that stage before they get close to student results.
So on to the next one, which feels like the big one, I think. Grade boundaries. Now, you touched on this earlier. As you said, this means how many marks a student needs to reach whichever grade we're talking about. So once the marking is complete, and we've talked about controls in place to make that as fair and as consistent as possible, how are the boundaries actually set? Because I'm aware there are definitely some myths out there for this. I'm going to hold my hands up here and apologise to some of my ex-students, because I remember actually probably sharing some of the myths, which now working at Ofqual I realise are absolutely false, that it's based on a normal distribution curve and various other things. It's not, but please do tell us how.
Absolutely, and it is really sort of one of the big questions. I mean, it's something we could talk about all day if we had all day. And actually during the summer, that is exactly what I do all day, is talk about setting grade boundaries. Well, fundamentally, when an exam board is setting grade boundaries, what they're doing is making sure that it's no harder or easier to get a grade in that year compared to any other year. And what that means is that for established qualifications, the standard of work, so the quality of what a student has written, should be exactly the same this year compared to any other year. And I think it's one of the myths is that it's not just about that quality of work, that there's somehow a cap on the number of students who can
the
get
number
a
of nines that
yes.
get on the number eights.
And that's really not the case. So the way that exam boards go about working out where those grade boundaries should be is they start with some information about the cohort, they think about the difficulty of the paper, and the people who are setting grade boundaries have been involved in marking, so they really know how students have responded to this paper. They know better than anybody what's happened and what the difficulty of the paper is this year. And then, using that information, they identify regions where the grade boundaries might be, so a range of different mark points. And then the awarding committee, made up of those senior examiners, looks at several exam scripts on each mark point and looks really carefully at the quality of work on each mark point. And by doing that, they can work out exactly which mark point represents the quality of work you need to get that grade in a given year. And if you ever get the chance, it's really fascinating hearing those conversations where, because these are real experts talking about the precise qualities that's needed to get, say, a grade 4 at GCSE or a grade A at A Level. They are the real experts.
Sorry, I'm just thinking out loud here. So they see a selection of scripts at that mark point. So let's say, I don't know, it's a 100 mark paper and they're looking at the 79 or 80 mark point. Presumably there'll be a vast number, and they're only going to see a sample of the scripts that are at that point. How do they balance that sort of possible risk that they don't get a representative sample, for example, of the 79 or 80 mark point?
Well, I think one of the key things is that because the people on the committee have been involved in marking, they have seen that representative sample, they have seen a really wide sample, and the scripts that are chosen to be quite representative by the exam board. One thing I should add is that before the series, Ofqual actually puts in place some requirements on the exam boards. So each exam board is using the same sorts of information and selecting scripts in the same sort of way. And that just makes sure that each exam board is working consistently. So it's never going to be harder or easier to get a grade with one exam board compared to another.
And they're not cherry-picking particular scripts, which may make things easier or harder. Okay.
So just thinking about what this means to students then. So if a student was to take a difficult paper, what would that mean for the grade boundaries, for example?
Absolutely. So if an exam board looks at a paper and sees that maybe one year students have achieved fewer marks on that paper compared to previous years, and they know that it's difficult, what that means is that the grade boundary that would be set would be lower because it's harder to achieve more marks. Same as if students get more marks on exam paper, then the grade boundary would be set higher. And that's just to reflect the difficulty of the paper.
Yeah.
It's not about making sure that the same number of students get that grade.
Right.
So in that case then, would you say it's not very helpful for students to look at past papers to see where the grade boundaries are set if they're trying to aim for a particular grade? Because I think that is what we hear that students do, and teachers sometimes.
So they shouldn't assume that the same grade boundaries will be set for the paper that they took. It's useful, of course, to look at past papers and look at the grade boundaries that were set for those specific past papers. But each set of grade boundaries is specific to the paper because it's directly about how easy or difficult that paper was.
And I think you touched on this earlier, but could you explain why boundaries may differ between exam boards?
Well, it's exactly the same issue. Because exam boards set different questions, because the papers are set independently, it might be that one year one exam board has a slightly easier paper compared to another. And so if the paper is slightly easier, then obviously that should lead to higher boundaries.
Why do you think there are quite a few sort of misconceptions out there about grade boundaries being set before papers have been marked and that type of thing?
It's a really good question. I think a lot of people might assume that happens when the paper is being set. But of course, you don't ever really know how difficult a paper is going to be until students have actually sat it.
Mm-hmm.
So exam boards, they can never actually set the grade boundaries ahead of the series. And that's kind of one of the exciting things about grading in the summer, is that you just don't know until you look at the information, you work out how difficult the paper was. You just don't know where those grade boundaries will be exactly.
And what about higher grade boundaries, meaning that it's harder to achieve a given grade?
Again, absolutely not. You only get higher grade boundaries if the paper itself was easier.
And we've talked about how Ofqual oversees the awarding process between different awarding organisations. We sometimes hear students or teachers say that it might be easier to get a certain grade with one exam board than it is with another. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, fundamentally, the quality of work that you need to produce to get a grade is the same regardless of the exam board. Of course, exam boards do take slightly different approaches to the way they organise the content, and it might be that some teachers prefer one exam board over another for that reason, and so it fits in with their style of teaching better, so they feel they can teach more effectively. But fundamentally, there is no difference in difficulty between exam boards.
That's something, I mean, speaking for myself again here, I think that's something I've really recognised now. I'm stepping out of the classroom because having been a teacher, I've taught two specifications, so two different boards version of GCSE maths, and we ended up sticking with one over the other for basically the reason you've just described. It suited our students and it suited our teaching style. Having come out of the classroom now and now having the opportunity to look at all four boards papers for GCSE maths, I can see that actually, yes, there are some differences, but broadly speaking, they're all covering the same stuff and they are at an equivalent level of difficulty. Very occasionally you might get a slightly harder paper one year with one, but then the boundaries will change to reflect that. So it's definitely the case that, well, at least from my perspective, I don't think any one specification is easier or harder than the other. I think when you're in the classroom, that perception exists, but that's probably just because we're used to teaching, I've always taught X exam board, so that's the one I'm used to teaching. I find it easier. That doesn't mean it is easier, though, I think is the point.
Could we talk about the national reference test? So this is an important part of the picture when it comes to setting standards for GCSEs. And I've heard it be called the most important secondary school test that no one's heard of. So could you tell us a bit about what it is and how it works?
Absolutely. So the National Reference Test is a test taken by a representative sample of Year 11 students each year, not long before they sit their GCSE exams in February and March of that year. This year, for example, it was taken by just over 13,000 students across over 300 schools. So it's not a tiny test, but it is quite small compared to the number of students who are taking GCSEs, for example. The tests themselves are in English language and maths, and they use questions that are very similar to the style of questions that are used in GCSE English language and maths exams. So they're a good window into GCSEs. I think the really important thing to remember about the National Reference Test is that it's not about individuals, it's not about schools, so it doesn't count towards school performance measures. It's all about understanding what's going on at the national level. And you might think, well, that's great. Why are we making 13,000 students take an extra test each year? They're probably not delighted by that. Well, because it's such a consistent test, sort of year on year, and it's been running since 2017, the first year that those GCSE English language and maths specifications were introduced, what we can do is use it to track national attainment in those subjects over time.
Right, okay.
And so that means it's a really, really important piece of additional evidence that we can use when we're setting grade boundaries in English language and maths. And what it means is that we can be extra confident that standards have been maintained in those subjects because they are so crucial for students' future careers and progress.
And does Ofqual publish that data?
It does. It's published on GCSE Results Day.
Okay, so that gives people a bit of an indication of the national picture alongside GCSE results.
It does, yeah.
So we've spoken a bit about that grading process. One of Ofqual's job is to ensure that standards are maintained over time. So what does that look like? Is that we've sort of spoken about what results might look like on a yearly basis, but thinking about that consistency over time, can you give us a bit more information on that?
Absolutely. So one of the things that senior examiners are doing when they're looking at exam scripts, when they're setting grade boundaries, is that they're directly comparing them to exam scripts on the grade boundaries that were set last year from last year's papers. So they've got that comparison in their mind to make sure that that quality of work is the same. Some years ago when I worked in an exam board and I was involved in this grade boundary setting process, when I was thinking about some grade boundaries, I'd always imagine I had two students in front of me. One of them had taken the paper that year and one of them had taken the paper the year before. And I needed to feel absolutely confident I could explain to both students why this year's grade boundaries were fair. Because it's not just about doing something that's fair for this year's students, it also needs to be fair for last year's students, because we don't want to advantage this year's students over last year's, or vice versa.
Yeah, that's a really interesting reflection. So it's about advantage and disadvantage for both sets of
Over time,
students. Yeah, okay.
And one really important thing to remember is that when exam boards are using information to set grade boundaries, Ofqual puts in place requirements to make sure that exam boards are using the same information in the same way, to make sure that it's no harder or easier to get a grade with one exam board compared to another.
Okay. And what about when qualifications are changed or sort of specs are reformed? So we know that there's been changes to modern foreign languages this year. What does that process look like, and how can we still ensure that the standards are the same when the specs look different?
That's a really good question. Well, we know that when something changes and assessments change, is that teachers will be just a little bit less familiar with those assessments. And so students might achieve a very small number of marks fewer than they would have done had the question papers been much more established. And obviously we don't want students to be disadvantaged if they happen to be in the early years of a new specification. That just wouldn't be fair. So in that circumstance, we accept a slightly lower standard of work to compensate for that fact. It's not a huge effect. It's normally only maybe 1 or 2 marks, if that. It's very small. But we do bear that in mind when grade boundaries are being set.
So just bringing this back to teachers then, if a student came to you as a teacher and feel that they've had a raw deal with their grades, what would you advise sort of teachers to say to their students?
Well, I think the first thing would be to explain how grade boundaries are set. So making sure the student really understands that if the grade boundary is higher than they're expecting, that's because they had a slightly easier paper. And had the paper been harder, that a lower grade boundary would have been set to make sure that it was fair, that because of the difficulty of the paper.
Yeah, so that makes it quite difficult to predict grades.
Well, because teachers have access to past papers with the grade boundaries that were set for those papers,
Sure.
They can use information from student mocks to help predict. What I think might be more difficult is to predict what grade a student will get based on what they say about their performance in the exam.
Yeah.
Because I think we all know we've sat exams. It can be just one question that makes you feel like you've done terribly, but actually that was only 3 marks out of 60, and it won't have that much bearing on the overall grade.
Yeah, that's really helpful advice, thanks.
So a phenomenal amount of work and a phenomenal amount of scrutiny goes into the marking and grading of GCSE and A Level exams, but that's all ultimately in pursuit of one very simple thing: that the quality of students' work in their exams is what determines the grade they get given, by making sure that no one is advantaged or disadvantaged by the year in which they happen to sit the exam or the board with which they happen to sit the exam. It is so important that students understand too, so they can trust the grades that they work so hard to earn. They may be looking to you for reassurance on this, so please make sure you're giving them the facts, not the myths. And Ofqual's here to help you do that. We have a lesson plan if you want to take 20 minutes in the classroom, take some time, and a presentation to use, possibly in an assembly or an internal staff CPD, or indeed in an information evening. Find the links for these in the show notes or at gov.uk, along with our wider Understanding Grading Toolkit featuring FAQs for teachers, covering what we've heard on this episode from Francis.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back on the 13th of August with a live A-Level Results Day special, giving you the national picture to help put your own school's results in context. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your colleagues, and if you've got a question or topic you'd like us to talk about, please get in touch. The address is in the show notes, and we'd really like to hear from you. So until next time, I'm Jess.
I'm Junaid.
Thanks for listening.